Imagine this. You're sitting across from someone you care about, maybe a friend, a partner, a sibling. They're laughing, telling a story, their words painting something light and harmless across the surface. But as you look at them, really look, something inside you recoils, because behind the words, behind the face, behind the laugh, you see it. A flicker of pain they don't mention, a contradiction between their words and what their eyes confess, a pattern repeating itself again and again, one they haven't noticed but one you've seen too many times before. It's not what they said, it's what they didn't say, the silence between sentences, the way their hands clench when a certain topic arises, the way they smile just a bit too quickly when you ask if they're okay. And you wonder, do they even know who they are becoming? You don't say it. Of course you don't. What would be the point? If you tell them what you see, they'll likely deny it, get defensive, turn away. They'll call you intense, judgmental, too deep, or worse, paranoid. So you nod, you smile, you play the part. But something inside you begins to fracture, because now you're no longer having a conversation. You're holding back a truth they're not ready for, and you are left carrying a reality no one else seems to notice. This is the curse of seeing too much in people. It sounds noble, even admirable, doesn't it? The idea that you can read between the lines, feel what others suppress, recognize patterns they can't even name. You see the trauma beneath the bravado, the wounds stitched into jokes, the shame that hides behind ambition, and perhaps at first, it feels like a gift, like insight, like wisdom. But over time, it begins to rot. Because what do you do with all that truth? What happens when you see too deeply into others but can't unsee it? When you realize that most of the people around, you are wearing masks, and no one wants you to look beneath them? What happens when love becomes impossible because you always see the cracks? When friendships become fragile because your mind won't let you play pretend? When connection becomes loneliness because you're the only one seeing the whole picture? And most unsettling of all, what happens when you start seeing yourself the same way? When you recognize your own masks, your own defense mechanisms, your own blind spots? When you realize that just as others are hiding, so are you. And yet, you cannot stop analyzing it. You can't relax. You can't unfeel. Your empathy turns into surveillance, your awareness into a prison. You start to see patterns in people you haven't even met yet, archetypes, shadows. You listen to someone talk and can trace their pain back to something their parents never said. You feel the tension in a room before anyone speaks. You sense the inauthenticity of "I'm fine" before the words even land. And there's a terrible irony to all of it. The more you understand people, the harder it becomes to relate to them. Because people don't want to be seen. Not really. They want to be admired, idealized, reassured, but not seen in their raw, tangled, unprocessed form. And certainly not by someone who won't look away. So where does that leave you? A quiet observer in a loud world. A psychologist without a license. A philosopher drowning in pleasantries. A mind too awake in a society that sedates itself with denial. You nod along with shallow conversations, but your soul is somewhere else. You date people who talk about goals but can't face their wounds. You go to dinner parties and feel like a ghost in a room of mannequins. And yet, you can't stop. You won't stop. Because something in you believes that seeing people as they are is the first step towards something real. That truth matters more than cis and comfort. That depth is not a burden, but a calling. That love is not about fixing people, but about refusing to look away. Still, the questions linger, echoing louder with each revelation. Is it better to live with illusions, or to suffer for seeing the truth? What do you do when your empathy becomes exhausting? How do you love people you can no longer idealize? Is it fair to expect truth in a world built on performance? And what happens to you when you always see too much and no one sees you back? Perhaps the most dangerous thing is this. Once you've seen someone's inner world, once you've traced the threads of their psyche, witnessed the inner war they don't speak of, it's nearly impossible to hate them. And yet it's just as hard to stay close, because closeness requires illusion. It requires that we sometimes let people be who they believe they are, even if we know better. But when you see too much, you can't pretend anymore. You can't just play along. And that makes you different. Not superior, not enlightened, just other. Always a few steps removed, always torn between compassion and exhaustion, between clarity and isolation. And that's the real curse, not just seeing too much in others, but realizing how few are willing to see you back. Not your performance, not your pleasantries, but your own complexity, your doubts, your depth, your vision, your silence. The world calls it overthinking, sensitivity, moodiness, but maybe it's none of those things. Maybe it's a rare form of perception, a rare kind of burden, a gift twisted into grief. And so the question emerges, not one of diagnosis, but of existence. What do you do when you can see into people's souls, but they only want to show you their surface? This is where the story truly begins. Because beneath this question lies something ancient and aching, something philosophers, psychologists, mystics, and madmen have wrestled with for centuries, and the deeper we go, the more disturbing the truth becomes. There's a reason this curse exists. It doesn't come from nowhere. To see too much in others is not just the result of intelligence or empathy. It's often a scar forged in childhood, sharpened by survival, and spiritualized by a need to make sense of what was once unbearable. It's not just that you can read people, it's that you had to. At some point in your life, it wasn't safe to take people at face value. Maybe you were raised by someone who smiled with their mouth but not with their eyes. Someone who said, "I love you," but only after emotionally withdrawing for days. Someone whose moods could shift like weather, leaving you to scan every word, every gesture, every silence for signs of an incoming storm. And so, like a child lost in a war zone of subtle signals, you developed your own radar. You learned to see what wasn't being said. You learned to recognize pain behind performance. You studied tone, body language, inconsistencies, not for curiosity, but for survival. Carl Jung would call this the birth of your complexes, patterns of perception and reaction forged in emotionally charged moments. You didn't just learn how people worked, you learned how people hid. And once you've developed the ability to see behind the mask, it's nearly impossible to forget that masks exist. Jung also speaks of the shadow, the repressed, denied, and unconscious aspects of the self. Most people go their whole lives without ever confronting it. But for someone cursed with deeper vision, the shadow isn't just a theory. It's visible, often overwhelming, and dangerously seductive. You begin to notice that the most cheerful people are often hiding profound sadness. That the kindest ones may be driven by guilt or people-pleasing trauma. That moral superiority is often a disguise for hidden shame. And it's not just cynical, it's pattern recognition. But here's the problem. The psyche was never designed to carry too much truth all at once. Arthur Schopenhauer argued that if humans saw the world for what it truly is, if they grasped the full extent of suffering, illusion, and ego-driven behavior, they would collapse under the weight of it. That's why denial exists. That's why illusions are built. That's why society creates rituals, distractions, and beliefs to keep the unbearable at bay. And yet here you are, stripped of those illusions. You can't just enjoy a simple conversation because you can feel the unresolved tension in the other person's voice. You can't just listen to someone vent about their problems because you can see how they're creating them. You can't just fall in love because you can see their wounds before they do. You can't just relax because you never stop seeing. And society doesn't help. In fact, it punishes this kind of perception. We live in a world that rewards appearances and punishes depth, a world where image is currency and authenticity is dangerous, where to be nice is valued more than being truthful, where curated personas are worshipped and psychological insight is dismissed as too much. As Aldous Huxley warned, the more society becomes addicted to comfort and entertainment, the more it will fear truth. And the more it fears truth, the more it will marginalize those who speak it. So what happens to those who see too much? They're labeled, misunderstood, often pathologized. You speak the truth, and they call you negative. You point out the contradiction, and they call you critical. You ask a deeper question, and they call you intense. You express concern, and they call you controlling. You speak of patterns, and they accuse you of projecting. And maybe sometimes they're right. Because this gift, or curse, isn't always clean. It's not always objective. It's shaped by your own trauma, your own projections, your own shadow. Your ability to see into others is filtered through the lens of your own pain. Jean-Paul Sartre once said, "Hell is other people." But what he meant wasn't that people are inherently evil. It's that being in the presence of others who are blind to themselves, who see you through their distorted lenses, who live behind masks, can feel like psychological suffocation. And when you see too much, you are constantly confronting this. You see the web of delusions people build around themselves. You see the games, the scripts, the unconscious roles everyone plays. You see how few people are truly aware. But awareness is a lonely place. It isolates, it alienates, it creates a private world that few can enter. Because the moment you become aware of someone's deeper truth, a rift forms between who they think they are and what you know they are running from. This is why relationships become strained. This is why small talk feels agonizing. This is why silence becomes more honest than words. And yet, even as you suffer for your perception, part of you clings to it, because it gives meaning to your pain, because it makes you feel less crazy, because it reminds you that what is real matters more than what is comfortable. But even deeper than that, beneath the trauma, the pattern recognition, the philosophical weight, lies something even more ancient, a longing to be met, to be understood, to be seen back, not just superficially, not just in words, but in essence, because those who see too much are rarely seen themselves. Their depth is mistaken for intensity, their honesty mistaken for rudeness, their insights mistaken for judgment, their sadness mistaken for weakness. You begin to ask yourself, am I cursed because I see too much, or because no one else wants to see at all? Is this isolation the price of awareness, or have I built walls around myself because I no longer believe others are capable of? FCS meeting me where I am. The mind spirals, endlessly looping through observation and reflection, echoing Nietzsche's warning, when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. That's the terrifying part. To see too much in others is to inevitably see too much in yourself. And when everyone around you seems to live behind pleasant illusions, you begin to feel like a ghost among the living. A watcher, never watched. A listener, never heard. A knower, never known. But here's the dangerous twist. In a world where everyone is hiding, your sight becomes threatening. Not because you are wrong, but because you remind people of everything they are trying to avoid within themselves. And still, the curse persists. You walk through life not just perceiving the surface, but watching people contradict themselves in real time. You see the damage they do to themselves and others without even realizing it. You watch the same emotional loops play out in different faces. You listen to words soaked in wounds. You witness the world spinning faster, more distracted, more numb, and you wonder, are we evolving, or just getting better at hiding from ourselves? And still, something in you refuses to go blind again. Something in you knows that behind the pain, behind the shadow, behind the lies, we are all reaching for something real. You just wish more people were willing to see it. You don't realize the cost at first. You think it's just a personality trait. This perception, this sensitivity, this way of watching people unfold like pages, only you seem to know how to read. But slowly, quietly, it begins to erode things you didn't know could be touched. You stop trusting easily, not because of betrayal, but because you see how easily people betray themselves. You stop speaking your full mind, not out of fear, but because you know it won't land. You start pulling back, not because you don't care, but because caring starts to feel like drowning in a sea of someone else's denial. This is the first unseen consequence: emotional isolation. It's a strange and painful paradox. You understand people deeply, yet feel increasingly misunderstood. You can feel others' emotions even when they can't name them, but when it comes to your own, people often miss the mark completely. You crave deep connection, but your own depth becomes a barrier. Why? Because emotional intimacy is rarely about truth. It's about mutual illusion. It's about two people agreeing, consciously or not, to only look so far, dig so deep, risk so much. And when one person sees more than the other can handle, the intimacy fractures. You can feel this fracture in real time. Someone says, "I just want to be seen." And you do see them. You see all of it, the light, the shadow, the trauma, the armor. But when you reflect it back, gently, lovingly, they flinch, or they shut down, or they lash out, because being truly seen feels like exposure, not validation. And most people want the latter, not the former. The second consequence is empathic fatigue. When you see too much, you don't just observe, it enters you. You absorb micro-expressions, contradictions, tone shifts. You carry conversations long after they end. You remember the things people almost said. Your nervous system becomes a mirror. Your empathy becomes a sponge. And over time, you begin to collapse under the emotional weight of other people's unconsciousness. You become overwhelmed, not by noise or crowds or lights, but by the constant dissonance between what people say and who they really are. You can't unfeel it, you can't tune it out. This leads to a kind of cognitive dissonance that gnaws at the soul. Society says, just enjoy the moment. But how do you enjoy the moment when you can see that your friend is self-sabotaging through humor? How do you enjoy a date when you can feel your partner's buried resentment behind their compliments? How do you go to work when your boss's charisma masks deep insecurity that creates chaos for everyone? It's not that you're pessimistic, it's that you know too much. You've read too many emotional blueprints. You've watched too many unconscious patterns destroy the very connections they seek to create. The third consequence, identity erosion. When you constantly adjust your energy, language, or presence to avoid overwhelming others, you start losing track of who you are without the filter. You begin to shrink, not visibly but internally. You speak less, not because you have nothing to say, but because so few can meet you where you are. You start questioning whether your insights are a gift or a glitch. You begin to wonder, am I the problem? Here's where the psychological trap deepens. Most people survive socially by adopting what psychologists call the false self, a curated identity that protects the fragile ego from rejection, vulnerability, or authenticity. Donald Winnicott, a psychoanalyst, described how people develop this mask early in life, especially when they sense that their true feelings won't be accepted. But when you see through the false selves of others while struggling to maintain your own, something breaks. You stop playing the game. You stop faking enthusiasm. You stop smiling when you're dying inside. And suddenly, you feel more alone than ever. This is the hidden danger of authenticity in a world that prefers performance. The fourth consequence, existential grief. When you see too much in people, you don't just see their behavior, you see their potential. You see the child they were before the world told them who to be. You see the brilliance they've buried under roles and rules. You see the tenderness beneath the rage, the genius behind the fear, the creativity trapped beneath survival mode. And when they can't see it themselves, or worse, when they refuse to, you feel a kind of grief that has no name. It's not just disappointment, it's mourning. You mourn the parts of them they'll never touch. You mourn the beauty they were taught to be ashamed of. You mourn the lives they could have lived, the love they could have given, the peace they'll never feel, because they're too busy being who they were told to be. This grief accumulates. You carry it like dust in the lungs, invisible, but suffocating. The fifth and final consequence is perhaps the hardest, self-abandonment, masked as insight. Because when you see too much in others, it becomes easier to focus on them than to face your own pain. You analyze their wounds to avoid your own. You hold space for their truth while ignoring the ache in your chest. You become the mirror, the healer, the observer, but slowly, imperceptibly, you begin to disappear. You forget how to ask for help. You forget how to be messy or wrong or confused. You forget how to not know. And worst of all, you start to believe that being understood is a luxury you don't deserve. You tell yourself, as long as I can understand them, I'll be okay. But that's a lie. Because understanding is not a substitute for connection, insight is not a replacement for intimacy, and seeing is not the same as being seen. So you start living in a world of ghosts. People who speak but don't reveal, who smile but don't feel, who exist but never arrive. And you wonder, what am I even doing here? You begin to feel like an exile from the very world you long to belong to, not because you are better, but because you cannot unsee. And the more you feel this, the more the temptation grows to shut it all off, to go blind, to numb out, to pretend. But something in you resists, because even as it isolates you, burdens you, wears you down, this vision, this perception, this unbearable gift, it also feels like truth. And something in you refuses to live a lie, which leads to the breaking point, the inflection, the rebellion. The moment where something inside you says, enough. Not out of resentment, but resolve. Not to hide, but to transform. Not to conform, but to reclaim. This is the moment you stop carrying everyone else's unconsciousness. This is the moment you stop waiting to be understood. This is the moment you stop apologizing for seeing what others won't. And it's only the beginning. Because now, finally, you're ready to break the curse, not by going blind, but by seeing differently. It begins not with anger, but with a quiet, resolute breath. Not a scream, but a whisper to yourself. I don't have to carry this anymore. This is the rebellion. Not the kind that fights the world with fire, but the kind that dismantles the internal prison built by decades of emotional overfunctioning. It's not about shutting down your vision, your empathy, or your depth, but about reclaiming what was lost in the process of seeing too much, yourself. You start by asking a dangerous question. What if seeing isn't the curse, but how I respond to it is? For years, your perception has been reactive. You saw and then felt responsible. You saw and then withdrew. You saw and then judged, carried, analyzed, diagnosed, protected, predicted, prepared. But what if seeing doesn't have to mean carrying? What if you could see someone's pain without needing to fix it? What if you could sense their patterns without becoming entangled in them? What if you could love someone without becoming their therapist, their mirror, or their savior? This is the rebellion, detaching your identity from your insight. It's understanding that you are not your perceptions. They are tools, not definitions. You can be aware without absorbing. You can be sensitive without becoming hollow. You can be discerning without becoming bitter. This rebellion is not a rejection of your depth. It's a refinement of it. It requires that you learn the subtle art of discernment without attachment, that you look into someone's shadow and say, I see it, but I don't need to step into it with you. That you hear their pain and think, I can hold space, but I will not lose myself in your storm. It means choosing boundaries over burnout, presence over performance, and most importantly, self-trust over compulsive empathy. Because seeing too much isn't the problem. What breaks you is believing you must become what you see in order to relate, help, or survive. That's a wound from the past. That's the child in you who had to predict the emotional weather of the room in order to feel safe. But you're not that child anymore. And this is your awakening. Now you begin to walk differently. You enter a room and still feel the energy shift, but you don't immediately contort yourself to match it. You hear someone's story and still feel their pain, but you don't drown in it. You notice the dissonance in someone's words, but instead of confronting or internalizing it, you let it pass, like a wave that no longer knocks you down. And here's the most revolutionary part. You stop trying to be the one who sees everything. You let go of the performance of omniscience. You allow yourself to not know sometimes, to be confused, to get it wrong, to be surprised. Because the more you see, the more tempting it becomes to live from your head, to analyze, interpret, intellectualize, control. But liberation comes when you return to your body, your intuition, your boundaries, your aliveness. You stop being a detached observer of the human experience and start living it fully. Yes, you still see the cracks in people's stories, but now you laugh anyway. Now you dance anyway. Now you cry without needing to explain the origin of every tear. You reconnect with the sacred mess of being human. And here, something unexpected happens. You become magnetic. People begin to sense your clarity, not because you're always analyzing them, but because you've stopped being pulled into their chaos. You radiate a strange kind of power, the power of someone who sees without judgment, feels without collapse, speaks without apology. This is what Carl Jung meant when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." You're no longer a mirror for others, you're a flame. And those who cannot face their own reflection will avoid you. But those who are ready, they will find you. And for the first time, you'll be met. Not managed, not misunderstood, not idealized, but truly met. Here's another paradox. When you stop needing people to meet your depth, they finally can, because your need no longer comes from desperation, it comes from wholeness. This is the rebellion, not against others, not against society, but against your own compulsion to oversee as a form of self-abandonment. You realize that your gift is sacred, but it is yours first, not something to be mined by the emotionally unavailable, the half-asleep, or the spiritually evasive. So you create new rituals. You pause before offering advice. You ask, is this my responsibility or just my reflex? You notice your urge to interpret and instead choose to feel. You recognize when you're scanning someone and breathe yourself back into your own body. You stop asking, how do I help them heal? And start asking, how do I stay whole in their presence? This rebellion is quiet, but it echoes. It echoes in your posture, in your words, in the way you no longer contort to make others comfortable. And slowly, the world begins to feel different. Not because others have changed, but because you're no longer hostage to your own hyper-awareness. Now, you use your sight like a lantern, not a spotlight. You shine it inward, you shine it forward. You shine it on those who are ready, not those who demand, distract or drain. And something sacred unfolds, a new kind of connection. One where you're not the fixer, not the analyzer, not the ever-vigilant protector, but a human, fully alive, fully flawed, fully free. You begin to meet at others in the middle, not in their wounds, not in your vision, but in the raw, imperfect terrain of honest relationship. You laugh more, you think less, you feel deeply, but no longer drown. And when someone speaks from their own truth, when they see you back, you don't flinch. You let yourself be held in that gaze. Not because you need to be understood to survive, but because you finally trust that you are more than what you see. You are not a function. You are not a diagnosis machine. You are not here to carry others' unconsciousness. You are here to live. And the curse? It's no longer a curse. It's a compass. A compass you no longer wield like a weapon, but hold gently, wisely, choosing where and when to point it. The rebellion was never about silencing your perception. It was about remembering that you exist beyond it. And that's when you're ready for the final truth. Not just a shift in behavior, not just a change in boundaries, but a complete redefinition of what it means to see at all. There comes a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when you stop looking through people and begin seeing with them. This is not the kind of sight that slices through illusion, not the hyper-analytical awareness you've worn like armor for so long, not the skillful decoding of human behavior you've perfected over years of emotional survival. No, this is something else. This is the moment you realize seeing too much was never about others. It was always about you. You thought the curse was that you could see into everyone else, into their trauma, their fear, their inner child, their mask. But the final truth is this. The curse was that you mistook that sight as your identity. The deeper curse isn't just perception, it's projection. You thought you were seeing others clearly, but often you were seeing yourself, your unhealed wounds, your suppressed emotions, your unmet needs mirrored back in them. It wasn't just that you saw too much, it was that you were too afraid to fully see yourself, so you studied others instead. You turned your vision outward because looking inward was too raw. You made yourself the observer to avoid being the observed. You took comfort in analyzing others because it kept you from being vulnerable. It kept you in control. But here's the final paradox. You can only truly see others when you've dared to truly see yourself. And for most of your life, you didn't. You saw your insights, your intellect, your compassion. But did you see your longing? Did you see your fear of rejection beneath your emotional detachment? Did you see how you used perception as a barrier, not a bridge? You were never just cursed with seeing others, you were cursed with not being seen by you. And when you finally let that land, something inside you collapses, not in pain, but in relief. Because the war is over. You don't need to keep proving your awareness. You don't need to keep deciphering everyone else's behavior to justify your existence. You don't need to carry other people's shadows to feel worthy of love. You begin to grieve deeply, not just for what you've lost, but for how much of yourself you've withheld. All those moments you were silent to preserve peace, all those times you shrunk your insights to avoid making others uncomfortable, all the ways you overfunctioned, overread, overfelt, just to avoid abandonment. But now you see, not them, you. The final and most powerful realization is this. You were never cursed by your vision. You were cursed by your belief that it made you unlovable. And the moment you stop believing that lie, your perception becomes power. Not power over others, power over your own narrative. You no longer ask, why can't they see what I see? Instead you ask, Why did I think I had to explain myself to those who couldn't? You no longer try to decode every emotional ripple in a conversation. Instead, you stay anchored in your truth, letting others come closer or drift away without trying to control either. You no longer look at someone's trauma and mistake it for a connection. Instead, you ask, can this person meet me in mutual depth, or am I trying to rescue them to avoid rescuing myself? You no longer confuse empathy with enmeshment, love with labor, intuition with insecurity, and in that shift your soul exhales. You finally come home to yourself. You walk through the world no longer as a hypervigilant scanner of other people's psyches, but as a sovereign being, open, discerning, and whole. You realize that love doesn't come from seeing everything in someone. It comes from being present with what they're ready to reveal and honoring what you choose to offer. Not every person is meant to be unraveled. Not every relationship is meant to be understood. Not every truth is meant to be spoken. Sometimes, freedom means letting people keep their masks without trying to rip them off. Because when you've seen your own shadow, when you've held your own contradictions with compassion, you no longer feel the need to expose everyone else's. You become a mirror, not a microscope. A lighthouse, not a searchlight. A presence, not a project. And from this place, this grounded, sovereign, loving place, you begin to meet the kind of people you once feared didn't exist. People who are not afraid of truth. People who have seen their own shadows and won't run from yours. People who don't need you to perform insight to feel close. People who see you back, not as a fixer, not as a thinker, but as a full, feeling human being. This is the miracle. When the curse lifts, not because the world changed, but because you did. You stopped turning your gift into a burden. You stopped making your perception a performance. You stopped carrying others as a way to avoid carrying yourself. And now you see everything, but you carry only what's yours. You see the pain, but you don't become it. You see the potential, but you don't try to awaken it without consent. You see the lies, but you don't need to confront them unless truth is welcome. You live with eyes open and heart intact. You finally understand what Viktor Frankl meant when he said, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." You once thought the challenge was to see more, but it was always to be more whole, more grounded, more sovereign. And now, here you are, no longer defined by what you see in others, no longer haunted by the blindness around you, no longer desperate to be understood. You are understanding. You are the answer to your own questions, and you are free. Free to see, free to feel, free to be seen. Not because the world makes sense now, but because you do.